The signs were always there, hidden in plain sight. But I was too blinded by love to see them. That morning in James's kitchen, the air was warm with the smell of coffee and the soft sound of spoons clinking against porcelain. We were talking about the wedding, flowers, music, guest lists. Just another ordinary day in what I believed was a happy life. But then something strange happened. James looked at his mother, Eleanor, and she looked back. No words were spoken, but something definitely passed between them. A slight twitch of her lips. A tilt of her head. And then James said suddenly and sharply, "Don't treat her with indifference." It didn't match the conversation. It didn't belong. The words hung there, heavy and cold, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I had seen these exchanges before. Quick glances, small movements, tiny gestures that made me feel like I was missing something. I'm a professional interpreter, fluent in 5 languages. But whatever they were saying, it wasn't anything I could translate. Not yet. Still, it unsettled me every time. As if they were communicating in front of me, but without including me. It wasn't just odd, it felt wrong. Their silent exchanges were becoming more frequent, more intense. And the more I paid attention, the more I realized there was a pattern. That morning changed everything. As Eleanor tapped her manicured nails on the granite counter, tap, tap, pause, tap, I saw something click in my mind. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. That rhythm meant something. My years of studying nonverbal communication suddenly became useful in a way I never expected. I decided right then and there, between sips of cold coffee and nervous glances, that I would figure it out. Whatever secret they were keeping, I needed to uncover it. Not out of curiosity, out of necessity. Because James's warning to his mother didn't sound like protection. It sounded like a threat, disguised as care. Over the next few weeks, I made it my secret mission. At work, I started keeping a notebook hidden in my desk drawer. I wrote down every gesture I saw, every glance, every tap, every shift in posture. I began to recognize Eleanor's dinner invitations for what they truly were. Not family bonding, but strategy meetings. James's shoulder movements. Eleanor's fingers. Together, they told a story I wasn't meant to hear. But I was listening now. And I was slowly starting to understand. Then, one Sunday brunch, it all came together. Eleanor tapped out the same rhythm. Tap, tap, pause, tap. But this time I understood it. She suspects. My blood ran cold. James's response, subtle and quick, was just as clear. A small movement of his coffee cup and a twitch of his eyebrow. Impossible, but they were wrong. I didn't just suspect, I knew. And I was only getting started. Whatever they were hiding, it wasn't just personal. It was planned, structured, and possibly dangerous. I had no idea how deep the deception ran, but I was determined to find out. Because the more I watched, the more I realized. Their secret language wasn't just a code, it was a weapon. And I was walking straight into its path. The deeper I looked, the darker it became. At first, I thought Eleanor was just a controlling mother. But as I studied their movements, I began to see something else. Something far more dangerous. Each gesture was intentional. Each signal a message hidden in plain sight. This wasn't just about family dynamics. This was coordination. Strategy. And I was the target. It was at one of her weekly dinners that I began to suspect there was money involved. Eleanor had invited 3 of James's ex-girlfriends, Rebecca, Michelle, and Lauren. I had always thought it was strange, but I brushed it off as her trying to stay friendly with the past. That night, though, I paid closer attention. When Sarah, James's college girlfriend, walked in, Eleanor tapped a slow rhythm against her wine glass. James gave the slightest nod and shifted his neck in a way I had seen before. I understood it now. She's still useful, that word. Asterisk useful asterisk echoed in my head. These weren't just exes. These were assets. After dinner, I excused myself to the bathroom. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and documented everything. I had started a spreadsheet by then, logging each gesture, each response, each pattern. And with every new entry, the picture grew clearer and more disturbing. These women were part of something bigger. They were being used, financially manipulated, and discarded. But for what? I found the answer in the most unexpected way. Another dinner invitation. This time I arrived early on purpose. I walked into the kitchen without knocking, catching Eleanor and James mid-exchange. Their hands froze when they saw me, but not fast enough. Eleanor's fingers had just tapped out. Transfer complete. James's posture responded. Account secured. I pretended not to notice, but inside, panic and clarity battled each other. Transfers. Counts. This wasn't about emotions. It was about money, lots of it. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions. Why keep in touch with these women? Why involve me? Why the secrecy? Began researching. During lunch breaks after work in the middle of the night, I started running background checks on James's exes. And what I found made my blood run cold. Each one had received sudden financial windfalls, inheritances, business funding, investment wins, right after their relationship with James ended. Always clean on paper. Always routed through offshore accounts. Always just after they gave Eleanor access to their financials. But it wasn't just James. It was Eleanor too. Before her marriage, she had been investigated for investment fraud in 3 different states. Charges dropped due to lack of evidence. But now, with what I was seeing, the pattern was undeniable. She hadn't stopped. She had simply evolved. And I was her next big move. At the next family dinner, I watched them like a researcher in the field. When Eleanor tapped out she's perfect for the Singapore account, I nearly dropped my fork. James's reply. After the wedding, I was the prize. My job at Global Securities, my access, my reputation, it was all part of their next phase. That night, while James slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and made my decision. I would take them down. But I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. Real, solid, undeniable evidence. Had to be smart, precise, and above all, invisible. Because the wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a transaction. And I was the asset they were about to cash in on. From that night on, I lived 2 lives. By day, I played the loving fiancé, picking out floral arrangements, trying on dresses, and smiling through cake tastings. But behind the scenes, I was building a case. Every glance between James and Eleanor, every twitch of a hand, every tap of a finger, I logged them all. I converted their silent language into a full system. It was no longer just strange behavior. It was communication with intent, and I was fluent now. My first real move was reaching out to Sarah. I knew it had to be subtle, so I arranged what looked like a casual catch-up over coffee. Her hands trembled as she stirred her cup, and I saw the same haunted look in her eyes that I'd seen in the mirror. When I asked if she'd ever noticed how James and Eleanor used gestures to communicate, she looked up sharply and whispered, "You've noticed it too." She thought she'd been imagining it. We all had. That was their greatest weapon, making us doubt our own reality. Sarah had kept her own records. She'd been too afraid to speak out alone, but with me, she found the strength to share. Together, we reached out to the others. Rebecca agreed to meet us at a quiet lunch spot out of town. Lauren came with her financial documents. Michelle joined through video from Chicago, where she had gone to escape. One by one, they opened up. The patterns were identical: romance, trust, shared accounts, subtle pressure from Eleanor to invest wisely. And then, just like that, they were out of the picture, each with a financial gift that came with invisible chains. But I was different. I wasn't meant to walk away with a windfall. I was the long game. My position at Global Securities gave me access to international financial systems. Networks they couldn't touch without me. That made me valuable. Too valuable to lose. They were playing the biggest con of their lives, and I was at the center of it. James, meanwhile, became more affectionate, more involved. He asked about my health, helped decorate the nursery, made plans for the honeymoon. But I knew now that every kind gesture was calculated. Every sweet word part of a much larger plan. I smiled and played along even when I wanted to scream. Sarah and I turned her gallery into our command center. Late at night we'd gather there. Me, Sarah, Rebecca, and Lauren, with encrypted calls from Michelle. We studied the transfers, matched dates with gestures, compared inheritance letters and fake legal paperwork. The deeper we went, the more precise their pattern became. They were artists of manipulation. But even artists make mistakes. Michelle reported that one of the recent transfers triggered an automated flag in her bank. Eleanor was getting sloppy. Or maybe desperate. Lauren noticed a new donation to her gallery from Eleanor's foundation. The same foundation that had paid out millions to James's past lovers through dummy companies. And now that same foundation was making preparations for something big, right around our wedding day. I cross-referenced the accounts. One company name kept popping up. Leonti. It had been tied to Sarah's inheritance. Now it was set to move $50 million, through channels only someone with my clearance could authorize. They were preparing for their final play. I was running out of time. One evening, I arrived early at Eleanor's house for dinner. I wasn't expected for another hour, but I wanted to catch them off guard. And I did. I walked into the kitchen and saw them in the middle of one of their exchanges. Eleanor's fingers were mid-tap, and James's eyes flicked toward her with the kind of urgency I now understood all too well. I didn't say a word. I just smiled and apologized for being early. But I had already seen it. The Singapore merger will be our biggest yet. After the wedding. Her exact signal. That night something changed. As James showered, I opened my laptop to review an encrypted file Sarah had sent me. Screenshots, emails, account transfers. I was so focused that I didn't hear the water stop. James walked into the room just as I shut the lid. He looked calm, almost amused. "Working late again?" he asked. But as he spoke, his fingers moved. Small signal. Eleanor. She wasn't there, but I realized with horror she didn't need to be. He was being recorded, monitored. Their entire system included silent surveillance, recorded gestures and movement for review. Forced a fake yawn. Just wrapping up a translation. But when I stood to leave, he gave the subtle twitch I'd learned meant verify. The next day, Eleanor invited me to lunch. Alone. For the first time. The moment felt rehearsed. Her hands moved across the tablecloth in calm, deliberate patterns. "We may need to accelerate the timeline." That was all I needed to know. They were getting nervous. I'd gotten too close. And now they were planning to move fast. That afternoon Sarah texted me. "They're asking questions about you. Be careful, James called later and suggested we move the wedding date up." "No point in waiting," he said cheerfully. "Mom's already handled most of the planning." I agreed like a good bride would, but I knew exactly what this was. Containment. The clock was ticking. That evening, as I reviewed every piece of evidence again, I spotted something I'd missed. Every ex-girlfriend's financial exit had been timed with surgical precision, right after she signed something. An investment, joint account, contract. What if the wedding wasn't the end of their plan? What if it was the start of something even worse? The next week I saw it clearly. During cake tasting, Eleanor made a gesture when she thought I wasn't watching. "Once she's gone, her network becomes ours," James responded with a calm nod and a small hand flick. Clean break. Like the others. They were planning to discard me. But not before using me to gain full access to global securities. That night, I transferred all my sensitive files to a private server. I encrypted everything. Every chart. Every transfer log. Every piece of their silent language translated into hard evidence. Sarah's gallery became our war room. All of us were there. Sarah, Rebecca, Lauren, and Michelle on a secure video call. Each woman brought proof. Each one had a piece of the same puzzle. And when we put it all together, it was overwhelming. Michelle reported a recent transfer that had set off an alert. Lauren had refused to sign paperwork for another grant, and Eleanor had shown up at her door the next day. We all knew they were pushing toward something big. Then I found it. An email notification left open on Eleanor's tablet during dinner. Transfer confirmation. Singapore. Leonti. Asterisk the same shell company from before. But this time, the transfer amount was enough to make everyone in the room gasp. $50 million. And it was set to move on our wedding day. That's when Rebecca shared one final revelation. James was married before, she said quietly. Before any of us. Her name was Diana Chen. The room fell silent. Diana Chen. I had seen that name in financial records. I'd assumed she was just a business contact. But now, digging deeper, I found the truth. Diana had worked at a bank in Singapore. She had flagged suspicious transactions connected to Eleanor's foundation. 2 days later, she was found dead. Ruled a suicide. I couldn't breathe. That night, driving home, I noticed cars that didn't belong on my street. My phone started glitching. Dropped calls. Delayed messages. They were watching me now, just like they had watched Diana. And James. He started pushing harder. Talking about final fittings, moving money for our honeymoon, locking down plans. His signals to Eleanor became sharp. Urgent. No loose ends. But this time I wasn't Diana. I had a plan. And I wasn't alone. I spent the next few days moving carefully, quietly. Every hour mattered now. I met with an old colleague from Interpol's Financial Crimes Division. Someone I trusted. I gave him a secure copy of the full case file. Not just the financial evidence, but the entire gestural language system we had decoded. Then I contacted Diana Chen's sister in Singapore, using a secure line from my office. What she told me shattered me. Diana had known. She had gathered proof. She had even started drafting a report to her bank's legal team. But she had made one mistake. She confronted Eleanor directly, trusting her position would protect her. It hadn't. I wouldn't make the same mistake. I set up a dead man's switch. If I failed to check in every hour, the files would be automatically forwarded to regulators in 5 countries. Eleanor and James would not walk away from this. The final dinner came sooner than I expected. Eleanor insisted on it. Just the 3 of us. A quiet evening before the big day, she said. I knew better. I dressed carefully, slipping the recording device into the pendant of my necklace. My phone streamed our location to Sarah in real time. She and the rest of the group waited at a secure site ready. Eleanor's dining room was a performance space, polished and rehearsed. Classical music, expensive wine, flawless silverware. But beneath it all was tension. As Eleanor served the appetizers, her fingers moved delicately across the tablecloth. Everything is prepared for next week. James reached for my hand under the table, tracing a pattern on my skin. Trust us completely. I almost laughed. Instead, I smiled, took a sip of wine and said, I've been thinking about Diana Chen. Everything stopped. Eleanor's hand froze midair. James's shoulder twitched. His warning signal. Kept my voice light. She worked at United Global in Singapore, right? Such a tragedy, her suicide. Drowned near the marina, wasn't it? The exchange between them was frantic now. Eleanor's fingers flew over her napkin. She knows, James responded. Impossible to prove. I leaned forward. That wedding venue you picked, it's beautiful. Right next to where Diana was found. I set my glass down and looked directly at James. Before you make that call, I said quietly, you should know your gestures are being recorded, translated and sent to Interpol. Everything you've signaled to your mother tonight, it's all logged. Every movement. Silence. Pure, paralyzing silence. James's face turned pale. Eleanor's hands went still. Then, for the first time, I spoke their language aloud. I recited their previous exchanges. Dates, locations, gestures, meanings. I repeated the code for Singapore account after the wedding, clean break, she suspects nothing. And finally, once she's gone, her network becomes ours. Eleanor tried to recover. Her hands moved again, fast, urgent. She's bluffing. I translated aloud. She's bluffing. Their confidence cracked. James stood suddenly, but I raised my hand. I wouldn't. I tapped my necklace gently. Everything you're doing now is admissible. every signal, every word. At that moment, headlights swept across the dining room windows. Doors slammed. Voices called out. The federal team entered, armed with warrants. Eleanor's hands moved one last time. Escape. But it was too late. Agents stormed in. James was pulled back from the hallway. Eleanor tried to speak, but no one listened. Her silent language had lost its power. For the first time, both mother and son were completely, utterly voiceless. The next 2 days were a blur of interrogations, depositions, and legal filings. I watched through one-way glass as Eleanor's hands moved furiously, trying to reach James in another room. But now everyone could read them. Every signal was more evidence. And then Diana's sister arrived, with her journals. Handwritten entries filled with dates, names, gestures. The final entry was dated just 3 days before her death. She knew, her sister whispered. She tried to warn others. And now, finally, someone had listened. The investigation moved fast. Once Diana's journals were verified, the scope of the scheme became undeniable. Eleanor had been running variations of the same con for decades, using James's charm and romantic entanglements as the perfect disguise. 17 women across 3 continents. Over $100 million stolen. The numbers were staggering, but they didn't tell the full story. The real damage was what they'd taken from each of us. Our peace, our confidence, our sense of reality. And the silence they used to orchestrate it all, that damn language of taps and twitches and nods, had become the strongest piece of evidence against them. The court couldn't ignore what they could now clearly see. I translated each gesture during testimony, matching them to documented transactions and communications. The prosecutors watched in awe as their private code crumbled in front of a courtroom filled with former victims. Eleanor stayed composed, until I took the stand. When I described how she and James had tapped out plans for the Singapore merger while I pretended to discuss wedding cake flavors, her facade cracked. Her hands moved without thinking, trying to reach James through their familiar code. But the judge had been briefed. The translators had been trained. Her every motion was caught, analyzed, and used against her. James tried to offer a deal. He would testify against his mother in exchange for leniency. But by then the damage was done. They had both been caught signaling to each other during cross-questioning, and that final act of silent collusion sealed their fate. Eleanor received a longer sentence, especially after Diana's case was reclassified, not as suicide, but as suspicious death under renewed investigation. James received 15 years. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. But this time it was our silence. Calm, final, victorious. Sarah hosted a gathering at her gallery weeks later. The same women who had once sat across from Eleanor in fear were now together again, not as victims but as survivors. Rebecca spoke first. "I thought I was crazy," she admitted, voice shaking. "The way they'd make decisions about my life, right in front of me, without ever saying a word." Lauren shared the gallery's cleaned-up financials, now free from Eleanor's foundation's grip. Michelle, back from Chicago, announced her legal aid fund had won a landmark case in protection for victims of financial manipulation. Our pain had been turned into purpose. The money was being recovered piece by piece. Shell companies were dismantled. Offshore accounts were frozen. But more importantly, the network we'd built had begun to grow. Women from other parts of the world started reaching out, some with eerily similar experiences. They'd never heard of Eleanor or James, but they recognized the pattern. And now they had someone to believe them, someone to help. I was promoted at Global Securities, leading a new fraud prevention division. We developed training modules for recognizing coercion patterns, both verbal and nonverbal. Banks adopted our guidelines globally. And the gestural analysis system we'd built. It became part of international financial security protocols. Diana's sister opened a financial empowerment center in Singapore in her memory. The photo from the center's launch sits framed on my desk. Her standing among the women who helped bring her sister's killers to justice. We're all smiling in the photo. But behind our eyes is something deeper. Strength born from pain. James wrote to me once from prison. The letter came in a plain envelope, with a steady but aged handwriting. He explained how Eleanor had trained him since he was a child. How the gestures started as bedtime games and became a way to separate him from the rest of the world. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he wrote. "I'm finally learning to speak for myself." I didn't reply. I placed the letter in my case files, another piece of a long, twisted history. Because the truth was, this had never just been about me. It had been about all of us. Every woman who was gaslit, manipulated, and left doubting her own sanity. Eleanor's greatest weapon had been silence. And now, her silence was what destroyed her. A year after the trial, I received an unexpected email. The sender's name was unfamiliar at first, Catherine Torres, but as I read her message, realization hit me hard. She had been one of Eleanor's earliest victims, back when James was still a teenager, only learning his mother's silent language. Catherine had read about our case in a financial journal and recognized the pattern instantly. "I thought I'd buried it," she wrote. "Convinced myself it was just bad luck. That I was naive. But it wasn't me. It was her. She had lost everything, her savings, her business, her reputation." Eleanor had worked her way into Catherine's financial life through a series of consulting opportunities, just as she would later do with all of us. But back then, Catherine had no one to compare notes with. No Sarah. No Lauren. No gallery or secret calls or spreadsheets full of decoded taps. She carried the shame alone for 25 years. I invited her to one of our support meetings at Sarah's gallery. She sat quietly at first, listening as the others spoke. But when it was her turn, something changed in the room. Her story mirrored ours. Same isolation. Same manipulation. Same invisible theft. And yet, the relief in her voice when she said, "It wasn't just me," reminded us why we'd done all of this. Why we had taken the risk, gathered the proof, decoded the silence. For women like Catherine. For Diana. For every woman who'd ever been made to feel crazy for listening to her instincts. Eleanor's conviction opened the floodgates. More women came forward, some from decades ago, their cases long forgotten or never reported. And during the extended investigation, a truth none of us saw coming was revealed. Eleanor's partner in her earliest schemes hadn't just been James. It had been her husband, James's father. He had disappeared over 30 years ago under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was ruled an accident. But now, with new evidence, the authorities suspected foul play. The case was reopened. Eleanor had built her empire of fraud on secrets and silence, including, it now seemed, one that had started within her own home. Even in prison, Eleanor tried to keep control. During supervised visits with James, she began using her hands again, her old language. But prison staff had been trained with our material. Her every motion was recorded, flagged, translated. Her code was no longer secret. It was surveillance. And then something changed in James. Maybe it was the walls closing in. Maybe it was years of guilt finally cracking through. During his final appeal hearing, he told the truth. About Diana. About the pressure. About how Eleanor had silenced anyone who got too close, including his own father. His testimony didn't reduce his sentence, but it gave Diana's family the closure they had waited years for. It also led to additional charges against Eleanor. Our story didn't end in a courtroom. It lived on through action. Rebecca's firm expanded globally, helping women protect their finances in relationships. Michelle's legal aid program won 3 major cases in the last year, setting legal precedents for financial coercion. Lauren's gallery became a hub for survivor art. Paintings, photographs, sculptures, even recordings of courtroom testimony layered with music and light. Her latest exhibition, Shadows in the Ledger, used security camera footage of Eleanor and James's silent exchanges overlaid with translations, a haunting reminder of how easily manipulation can hide in plain sight. I still kept Diana's journal on my desk. Some mornings, I'd open it and run my fingers over the worn pages. The careful handwriting. The notations. The dates. I imagined her sitting at her desk like I had, watching, writing, realizing. She hadn't just left us notes. She left us a blueprint. A warning. And we listened. Our support network kept growing. One day, as I ended a counseling session, a young banker paused at the door. "How did you know," she asked, "that it wasn't just in your head?" Smiled. "Because I started listening to the things that made no sense. And I wrote them down. And then I found others who were hearing the same things. The wedding dress I never wore. I donated it to a women's shelter. They sold it and used the money to start a financial literacy program for survivors of domestic abuse. Felt right, turning a symbol of manipulation into something useful, something powerful. And then came the message from Singapore. Diana's sister had opened her own empowerment center, using the training material we created. She included our silent language guide in every workshop. What was once a code for control had become a shield, a tool to recognize red flags before they rooted too deep. Eleanor's empire had fallen. Her silence shattered. Her gestures, once unnoticed, now studied and understood. And from the wreckage, we built something louder than words. A new language. One built on truth, connection, and the kind of power no one could ever steal again.